Welcome to Character Randomizer, January 2023, story A Grandmother's Love. The beauty of the sunset was obscured by the industrial cranes. The machines worked tirelessly to lift, move, and load metal shipping containers once upon a time, but now the drones did it all. The door slammed and Leong left the window. "Grandmother?" "I'm here. Come and eat." Her voice called. Her steps were heavy as she walked, thumping with the limp because of an old issue. "How was school? Did your exams go well?" 100% as always. "Is your hip out again?" Leong asked as he came into the living room. "Did you walk too much at work?" They smiled at each other with familial love, and he tried not to notice how synthetic-looking her hair was becoming. It was so pale it looked blue. She was old, so old, but the only one of his family left. "It's fine. I sit on my stool. I greet the fools. Sometimes I play with the one the bosses think are cheating, which I did today, and that's why I was able to stop and buy noodles for my favorite grandson." Jay grinned at him. "You're too good to me, grandmother. After dinner, I'll work on your hip," Leong promised. He set a bowl on the table and poured half the broth over half the noodles. "Eat it all. I will get more tomorrow," she insisted, as she began shuffling the cards he kept for her. I'm not that hungry," he lied, but he slurped loudly like he had as a child, so she would feel he appreciated it. Finishing half the algae powder noodles in fish broth, he wanted them to travel together. It was a foolish dream, but he needed to hope. "Grandmother? How would you feel about moving? Maybe some place where the gangsters can't threaten to feed us to Piranha if you don't work for them." He didn't remind her that such fish didn't exist anymore. He very carefully did not look at the printout on his desk. No. Your mother said we are to stay here until she returns. You are going to school, and I will work." Jay's body seemed to shudder as she stood, and he jumped up to help her. "Lay down in there so I can look at your hip." Leong didn't care that he would be crushed if she fell on him. Not now. Sit and eat. Finish all of it. Good soba is hard to find." Jay scolded as she hobbled into the living room. "Don't make me throw my slipper at you." Watching her go, Leong obeyed and ate all of it as he read the letter again. He slumped because it was a really good job opportunity. If he stayed, he would die from poverty, the bad air, and lack of food. If he left, she would die from the lack of his care. They couldn't go together because of her weight. He crushed the recycled plastic sheet into a ball and threw it in the trash with the food containers. He cleaned the kitchen until it was spotless, as she expected. Then he went into the living room, smiling fondly at finding her seemingly asleep in a recliner. "Grandmother, wake up." Jay's eyes opened slowly. "It doesn't do me any good to go to medical school if you don't let me practice on someone." Leong grinned, and she smiled up at him. "You're such a good grandson." 3 hours later, he helped her into her recliner, then went to his computer. The parts he needed for her synthetic hip were no longer made, and having them customized would cost all his savings. He fell asleep looking through the scrapper websites for anything more affordable. Mrs. Saxe read over Leong's shoulder. Her eyes speed-read everything he was researching. She was shocked to see how much her grandson needed to replace her artificial hip. He was such a good student and would graduate with his PhD soon. He had kept her body going despite everything. The implant he put in her brain when he was 11 to stop the onset of Alzheimer's worked, but there were some odd side effects, like gaining a lot of weight. Sometimes she heard voices, like broadcast frequencies, really, and she could see auras now, too, so she always knew when someone was bluffing. That was why the bosses forced her to work for them. She could literally see and hear who was a liar. They didn't know her secret because Liang always made certain she looked as normal and non-threatening as possible. Just a little old lady with blue hair, nothing to see here. She lifted him and carried him into his perfectly kept bedroom and laid him down. The exertion made her hip grind, but he shouldn't sleep at his desk, she thought. She set a plate of protein powder pancakes and a small tube of fruit paste by his bed before she left for work, with the letter he tried to hide in her pocket. Arriving at her job, she greeted the floor bosses and took her reinforced stool to the front. "Welcome to the Lucky Cat Casino. May I see your membership card?" she asked again and again. Some had theirs, some went to member services, some she sent away. She was very good at her job, and hearing the voices in her head helped. Again, she played at the tables, catching 2 cheaters and getting her bonus. Afterward, she asked to speak to the manager. "Yes, Mrs. Saxe? I would like to be allowed to play again." She folded her hands and bowed slightly. Chuckling, the manager shook his head. "I don't think so, at least not here." "I'm an honest player. I've never cheated. I help you catch cheaters. Why can't I play poker?" She was starting to get angry. "I take their money, not yours." The feeling crept up her neck, making her feel flushed to the core of her body. "Their money is my money, and I didn't say you couldn't play. I just said you couldn't play here." He grinned, showing his holographic teeth. "Then where?" Mrs. Saxe was almost afraid to ask. "Why do you need more money? You make enough to support your grandson, who has his student stipend. You never let him gamble," the manager demanded with a keen eye. She held out the letter, and he looked at it, then sat up. His shock was evident. "Is this real?" Please help me. I have some medical problems to take care of before he will leave me. I want him to go without worrying. He is a bright boy with a bright future. I love him and would do anything to help him." Mrs. Saxe folded her hands together tighter, making herself seem meeker. "But I don't want him to know I am gambling again." "What you do isn't gambling. It's practically witchcraft because you're so damned lucky." "I'll help you if you help me." The manager waited, then said, "Mrs. Saxe, I am losing a lot of customers to a few competitors, and if I close, you lose your job, and your grandson loses his chance at a better life. Do you understand me?" Her silver blue hair swung forward as she nodded once. "There are only 2 conditions," he dictated. "You cannot tell anyone I am bankrolling you, and I get 80% of your winnings." 50%, she retorted immediately. "My money. I deserve at least 75%. Saxe inhaled needlessly and noisily as her mind did the math. If she agreed to a 65-35 split, she could have the money she needed in a month for her hip, and in 3 months for Liang to take the job. The numbers and logic processed, then she was interrupted by the manager. "Mrs. Saxe, 62-38, or you get yourself another card shark and another greeter." She gave him the mild-mannered smile she used while playing, and he chuckled. "I like you. You are my best greeter, so I will be generous." 60-40 it is, and you must promise to never play in my casino again." Mrs. Saxe held out her hand, applying just the right amount of pressure. "You have a deal." That evening she arrived across district on an autobus, then walked to the address of another casino given to her after her shift as a greeter at the Lucky Cat. Dressed in the clothing of a moderately wealthy housewife and retiree, she played out her allotted time, then left to another one, and then another one. Legalized gambling was as common as movie theaters had once been. She froze, having a memory that wasn't hers. Or was it? She was sitting next to a man sharing popcorn from a bowl. He laughed boisterously. He loved those ridiculous comedies, while she liked the kind of movie that made one cry, but always had a happy ending. Turning her head, she looked out at the cranes moving up and down, moving across the docks and shuffling the giant shipping containers, while a little girl played on the floor. The beep of the crosswalk alerted her to move. No one noticed her frozen, just another oversized elderly lady ambling into another place to take all her money. She almost tripped, trying to lift her foot over the curb, and cursed her hip. Perhaps this wasn't a good idea. The hour on the bus between establishments, sitting rigidly upright, it made her whole body stiff. For Leong, she muttered, because he would never leave while she had a bad hip. The first and second month passed with Leong constantly complaining about her working double shifts as a greeter. Every evening he would work on her hips or adjust her neck and back. Soon the problems spread to her knees and ankle. "Grandmother, how much are you walking around? Is the Lucky Cat not letting you sit on your stool?" Leong demanded in frustration and worry. Her body seemed like it was failing in front of him. The mysterious delivery of the part for her synthetic hip was a blessing, but she was having so many other problems now. "Aye, stop fussing. I'm an old woman. Old women have joints that are bad and ache," she scolded as she set out dumplings made with real chicken and green peas. "Really? And where did you get the extra money for this and the parts and—" Leong choked for a moment. "I don't want to lose you." She kissed his dark hair, then pulled off his glasses and cleaned them as she had for over 2 decades. "You won't. And I am working enough to buy you more than our algae flour noodles and protein cakes. Now eat. You are far too skinny." He groaned indecently over the first bite, then his face paled as she held up the letter. "When were you going to tell me about this?" "Grandmother, I can't leave you." Jay patted his cheek. "This is an amazing opportunity. You can't refuse it. You're a miracle worker. Look what you've done for me. It would be wrong of me to selfishly keep your gifts from everyone else." His chin trembled, and he stuffed a bit of dumpling in it to keep from talking for a moment. Then he mumbled, "I'll go next year, I promise." She put more dumplings on his plate, leaving hers conspicuously absent. "I expect you to." They talked about the opportunity and were halfway through his meal when there was a loud pounding at the door. Both turned, startled because they were the only ones living in this building. "Go to your room," Jay snapped. "No, you can't. Not all alone. Your knees, your back." Leong refused. He looked around for anything to be used as a weapon. Then he rushed into his room and opened the drawer before pulling out his mother's military-issued pistol, loading the clip and chambering a bullet as the pounding grew into a cacophony. "Stay in your room. Jay shouted at him as the door burst inward. 2 men rushed in. When they saw Liang holding a weapon in the doorway of his bedroom, they shot him. Jay screamed as she caught him. Clutching Liang, with her fingers in the wounds, she stared up at them. Why? What do you want from us? Did you think we wouldn't notice how much money you were winning, or find out who was bankrolling you to swindle us, Mrs. Saxe? The taller of the two mocked. I'll kill you both, Jay swore. I'll burn your world to the ground if he dies. They laughed, mocking. Yeah, sure you will, Granny. Enjoy the credits you won. You'll need all of them to cover the flight to get him medical care. Oh, and don't worry about work tomorrow. You got fired from the Lucky Cat. They made a lot of noise as they left, shouting profanities and slurs because they didn't know what she was. They didn't know she had already called for help with the implant in her head. She wept, holding Liang and keeping her fingers in the projectile holds so he wouldn't bleed out. The AI Metabots ignored her completely as they tended Liang after they accepted her credit vouchers. The amount she had won at poker was many times what anyone knew, especially her boss at the Lucky Cat Casino. She packed Liang a bag of all the things he treasured and wrote him a note. The Metabots took the bag and left with Liang after she kissed his forehead. No tears leaked from her eyes as Saxe Jay sat on his bed, staring out at the beautiful sunset and the skeleton of cranes rusting over the harbor. She had one job, keep Liang safe until his mother returned, and she failed. He had saved her, given her a new life and purpose, and she felt in a way she never had before. I am the worst grandmother in the world. Lamenting, Mrs. Saxe Jay made herself get dressed. She wasn't going to work tonight. The hot streak she had planned had nothing to do with playing poker. She was going to burn every casino she frequented until she found the one that sent those 2 thugs after her and her grandson. She vowed to teach them how dangerous a grandmother's love could be. Commander, I'm Dr. Wilson Kramer, and I must say it is an honor to meet the defender of... The tall woman with dark hair and darker eyes cut his words off with a glance. She stared through the glass at the observation room, looking at the patient within, forcing herself to swallow, and ask, Are you certain that is my son? Yes, ma'am. The genetics are as close to 100% as they can be, Dr. Kramer announced. He is dehydrated, suffering from mild malnutrition. He suffered blood loss from being shot twice with a projectile weapon, caliber designation .38, but he came through surgery perfectly and should be waking up in an hour or 2. She clenched her fist, then flexed her finger, tapping her fingers to her thumb in a rhythm. The motion was a common coping mechanism for Space Fleet warriors with PTSD. And you have no idea how he survived on Earth alone since he was 3. No, ma'am. The Metabots that responded to the call were paid through an account that belonged to a Mrs. Saxe Jay, who doesn't seem to exist. There were no humans with him when they retrieved him, but someone packed him a bag with his personal items, and there are these. Dr. Kramer held out credit cards. Enough to get him to the Martian or Jovan colonies, buy a home pod, and proof of education that includes master-level certification of AI and bot technical work. He's almost got his PhD. The untenable commander from the Shaw Alien War shuddered as she wiped a tear. Are you okay, ma'am? Inhaling slowly, Yushan revealed, I thought I would never see him again. I left him with my mother at my home. Then the invasion came. I always thought my mother, who had early onset dementia, had become confused in the attack and that they were all killed. The Medical Service AI's android, Model J3H, never brought them to the port during the evacuation. She tapped her fingers against her thumb faster and faster. What address was he retrieved from? Dr. Kramer showed her, and she gasped, revealing, that was the tenement that my parents lived in near the port where I was born. Staring through the glass, she bowed her head. My mother did save him. Liang woke to the sound of a news podcast. And in the strangest news of the day, an old medical service AI Xandroid, made to look up like an overweight elderly lady, is reported to be the cause of a dozen casino fires in... You're awake, a familiar female voice stated, and he turned to look at a face he had not seen in 2 decades. What did you do to it? Why did you alter our service android to look like my mother? The images were of a battle zone. Mrs. Saxe staggered under the heavy fire while dragging the body of the man who shot him. He let his tears fall as the military intervened and looked away from the final explosions. She's not an android, not anymore. She was my grandmother, and she loved me, Liang insisted. The end. Thank you for listening to A Grandmother's Love, created with the help of writer Sam Wicker's Character Randomizer for January 2020. Be blessed and have a lovely day.